A debt-ridden teacher inherited an abandoned 1950s house that seemed like nothing but a burden. Everyone told him to tear down that ruin as soon as possible, but when he started tearing down the walls with a sledgehammer, his life changed forever. What he found hidden behind the false walls left the entire town in shock. But before we dive in, write in the comments which city you're watching from. It's always exciting to know where our community is spread across the world. If you love life-changing discoveries, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because we have more amazing stories coming your way. The morning sun filtered through the cracked blinds of Samuel Jones's one-bedroom apartment, casting thin lines of light across stacks of overdue bills scattered on his kitchen table. At 38, Samuel carried the weight of a man twice his age in his shoulders, his coffee-stained button-down shirt hanging loose on a frame that had grown thin from too many skipped meals. The apartment smelled of instant coffee and worry, a combination that had become his daily companion. He sat hunched over a laptop older than some of his students, grading papers while simultaneously calculating whether he could stretch his paycheck another week. The screen displayed his checking account balance, $247.83. His mother's latest medical bill sat unopened beside his elbow, another monthly reminder that teaching history at Jefferson High barely covered the present, let alone the mounting debts from the past. Samuel's phone buzzed. A text from his principal. "Budget cuts coming. Need to discuss your position Monday." His stomach dropped. For 15 years, he'd poured his heart into making the past come alive for kids who saw no future in their own town. Now even that was slipping away. The sound of his mother's labored coughing drifted from the bedroom. Emphysema, the doctors said. Years of working in the textile mills had taken their toll. The oxygen tank beside her bed hissed softly, a mechanical metronome counting down time they couldn't afford to lose. "Samuel?" Her voice was paper-thin. "Did that lawyer call back about Silas?" Samuel's jaw tightened. Uncle Silas, his great-uncle who'd been more legend than family, the strange old man who'd lived alone in that crumbling house on Maple Street, who'd died 3 months ago and somehow left Samuel his only inheritance. A condemned property with a demolition order from the city. "Yes, Mama, the house is mine, all right. Along with the $15,000, I don't have to tear it down." He rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar pressure building behind his eyes. The phone rang, sharp and insistent. Samuel glanced at the caller ID. City Planning Department. "Mr. Jones? This is Carol from the mayor's office. I'm calling about the property at 847 Maple Street. The demolition deadline is next Friday and we haven't received your contractor paperwork." Samuel closed his eyes. "I understand. I'll handle it myself." A pause. "Sir, that's a 2-story structure with potential asbestos. You'll need proper permits and—" "I'm a history teacher, ma'am, not a millionaire. I'll pull the permits and do what I can." After hanging up, Samuel stared at the stack of bills, then at the acceptance letter from the community college still pinned to his refrigerator. The teaching position that would pay $8,000 less than his current job, but offered his mother better insurance. He'd been too proud to take it. Now pride felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. That afternoon, driving his dented Honda Civic through the forgotten neighborhoods of Millbrook, Georgia, Samuel felt the familiar ache in his chest that came from watching a place die slowly. Boarded windows stared back at him like hollow eyes. Weeds pushed through cracked sidewalks where children once played. 847. Maple Street sat at the end of a dead-end road, surrounded by overgrown kudzu and the skeletal remains of what had once been a garden. The house sagged under the weight of neglect, its green shutters hanging at odd angles, the front porch steps soft with rot. A yellow notice from the city was stapled to the front door like a death warrant. Samuel sat in his car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled. This wasn't inheritance. It was burden wrapped in bureaucracy. But it was all he had left of family, all that stood between his mother and the county nursing home she'd made him promise never to put her in. He grabbed his toolbox from the trunk and walked toward the house that would either save him or bury him. The key Samuel had received from the lawyer turned easily in the lock, as if the house had been waiting for him. The front door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire structure, releasing the musty smell of decades-old air, mothballs, and something else. Something that reminded him of the archives in the university library where he'd written his thesis. Inside, the house felt like a tomb. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. The hardwood floors creaked ominously under his weight, and water stains bloomed across the ceiling like abstract art. Every step released small clouds of dust that made him cough. Samuel moved through the rooms methodically, his historian's eye cataloging the remnants of Uncle Silas's life. The furniture was sparse but solid, a few pieces that looked handmade, bookshelves lined with volumes on subjects ranging from carpentry to philosophy. In the kitchen, a calendar from 1987 still hung on the wall as if time had simply stopped. What struck him most was how deliberately sparse everything seemed. For a man who'd lived here for over 50 years, Silas had left remarkably few personal belongings. No photographs on the walls, no mementos on the mantelpiece, just the basic necessities of life arranged with almost monastic simplicity. "Jesus, Uncle Silas," Samuel muttered, running his finger along a windowsill thick with grime. "What were you hiding from?" He spent the morning taking measurements and notes, trying to formulate a demolition plan that wouldn't require equipment he couldn't afford. The house was solid despite its appearance. Good bones, as his grandfather used to say. The foundation was sound, the frame sturdy. It seemed almost criminal to tear it down, but the city had spoken. By afternoon, Samuel had decided to start with the interior walls. If he could strip the house down to its frame, maybe he could salvage some of the materials, reduce the debris load, and make the final demolition less expensive. He retrieved a sledgehammer from his trunk, a tool he'd bought years ago with optimistic plans for home improvement projects that never materialized. The first wall he chose was in what had once been a dining room, a partition that separated it from a smaller side room. The wallpaper was peeling anyway, hanging in long strips like dead skin. Samuel positioned himself, raised the hammer, and swung. The impact sent vibrations up his arms, but the wall held. He swung again, harder this time, and heard the satisfying crack of plaster giving way. Dust puffed out around the point of impact. The third swing broke through completely. Samuel expected to see wooden studs and maybe some old insulation. Instead, his sledgehammer had punched through into empty space. He pulled the hammer back and peered through the hole, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate the darkness beyond. The beam revealed not the narrow space between walls he'd expected, but what looked like a small room. Samuel's pulse quickened. He'd spent enough time in old buildings to know that hidden spaces weren't uncommon. Prohibition-era hiding spots, root cellars, even priest holes in older homes. But this felt different. The space was finished, with what looked like painted walls and a proper floor. He began working more carefully, using a pry bar to remove chunks of plaster and expose the opening. Within an hour, he'd revealed a doorway that had been walled over so seamlessly that no trace of it remained visible from either side. The opening was narrow, just wide enough for a person to pass through sideways. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he aimed his flashlight into the space. It was definitely a room maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with walls that had been painted a deep blue that had faded to almost gray in the darkness. But what made his breath catch wasn't the room itself. It was what he could see resting against the far wall. Wooden crates. At least a dozen of them, stacked neatly and precisely, each one bearing what looked like shipping labels or inventory tags. They were too far away to read in the dim light, but something about their arrangement spoke of care, of intention. These weren't storage boxes hastily shoved into a convenient space. They'd been placed there deliberately, methodically. Samuel squeezed through the opening, his shirt catching on the jagged edges of broken plaster. The air inside was different, drier, almost sterile. His footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, and when he ran his finger along one of the crates, it came away nearly clean. Whatever was in here had been protected from the decay that was slowly consuming the rest of the house. The nearest crate bore a label written in careful block letters. Collection A7, acquired 1963, climate-controlled required. Below that, in smaller script, Heritage Preservation Project, S.J. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. S.J. Silas Jones. His great-uncle hadn't just been a recluse living in a decaying house. He'd been collecting something, preserving something, and he'd gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it hidden. Samuel tried to lift one of the smaller crates, testing its weight. It was heavier than expected, solid as if packed with books or documents. The wood was good quality, joined with proper joinery rather than nails. Someone had invested serious money in these containers. He stepped back, sweeping his flashlight across the room one more time. In the far corner, almost hidden behind the larger crates, something else caught the light. Metal, gleaming dully despite the years. Samuel moved closer and discovered what looked like a small filing cabinet, its surface marked with the same careful labels. The top drawer was unlocked. Inside, Samuel found a manila folder marked Inventory Private. in the same block letters. His hands shook as he opened it, revealing page after page of meticulous handwritten notes, item descriptions, acquisition dates, condition reports, and at the end of each entry, a dollar sign followed by numbers that made Samuel's vision blur. $15,000, $32,000, $85,000. The figures climbed higher as he flipped through the pages. Some entries were marked with asterisks and notes like museum quality, or historically significant, or extremely rare. Samuel's academic training kicked in, and he began to understand what he was looking at. This wasn't a collection of random antiques. This was a curated archive, assembled with the precision of a professional historian and the resources of someone with serious money. But Uncle Silas had lived like a pauper. Samuel remembered visiting once as a child, seeing the old man in worn clothes, eating simple meals, driving a truck older than dirt. Where had this come from, and why had he hidden it? Samuel closed the folder, his mind reeling. He was standing in what amounted to a secret vault, surrounded by items that, according to these notes, could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more, and somehow, impossibly, it all belonged to him. The weight of the discovery pressed down on him like a physical force. Outside, his mother was counting pills and rationing oxygen. His job was hanging by a thread. His entire life was balanced on the edge of financial collapse. And here, hidden behind a wall in a condemned house, was what looked like his salvation. Samuel's hands trembled as he pried open the first crate with a crowbar he'd found among Silas's tools. The wood creaked in protest, nails groaning as they gave way after decades of holding their secrets. When the lid finally came free, he had to steady himself against the wall. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper and nestled in custom-cut foam, lay a painting. Even in the dim light of his phone's flashlight, Samuel could see it was extraordinary. The canvas depicted a jazz club scene, figures in 1920s dress, smoke curling through golden light. A trumpet player caught mid-note with an expression of pure transcendence. The brushwork was bold, confident, alive with movement and sound. Samuel carefully lifted the painting, turning it over to examine the back of the canvas. There, in faded ink, was a signature that made his knees weak. A. Douglas, 1926. Aaron Douglas, the father of African-American art, whose works hung in the Smithsonian and commanded millions at auction. This can't be real, Samuel whispered to the darkness. But as he examined the piece more closely, everything screamed authenticity. The canvas, the paint, the signature, even the slight crackling that came with age. This wasn't a reproduction. This was a lost work by one of the most important artists of the Harlem Renaissance. His pulse hammering, Samuel moved to the next crate. Inside, he found manuscripts, thick bundles of typed pages bound with string, the paper yellowed but pristine. The top sheet of the first bundle bore a title that made Samuel's breath catch, The Unfinished Symphony by Langston Hughes, with a handwritten note in the margin. Never published, LH 1955. Samuel's academic mind struggled to process what he was seeing. These weren't just valuable collectibles. They were pieces of American cultural history that scholars thought were lost forever. Each item he uncovered seemed more impossible than the last. A leather-bound journal filled with musical notations and lyrics in a hand he recognized from his graduate studies. Duke Ellington's unmistakable script. Photographs of jazz legends and civil rights leaders in private moments, signed and dated. A first-edition manuscript of Invisible Man with Ralph Ellison's personal annotations filling the margins. In the largest crate, wrapped in museum-quality preservation materials, Samuel discovered what appeared to be a complete correspondence between James Baldwin and Martin Luther King Jr. Letters discussing strategy, philosophy, and hope during the darkest days of the civil rights movement. Letters that weren't in any archive Samuel knew of, that could reshape understanding of that crucial period in American history. The filing cabinet yielded even more treasures. Maps of the Underground Railroad with routes marked in different hands, testimonies from former slaves that had never been published, and photographs documenting everything from Reconstruction to the Great Migration. Each drawer was a window into aspects of African American history that had been overlooked, suppressed, or simply lost to time. But it was in the bottom drawer that Samuel found the key to understanding how all of this had come to be hidden in his great-uncle's house. A leather journal, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling, bore the simple inscription, The Phoenix Project, S. Jones, 1952, 2018. Samuel opened the journal with reverent care. The first entry, dated September 15, 1952, was written in a young man's careful script. Today I made a promise to myself and to history. I will not let our stories disappear. I will not let ignorance and prejudice erase what we have created, what we have suffered, what we have achieved. They burn our books, tear down our landmarks, and pretend our contributions never existed. But I will be the keeper. I will preserve what they would destroy. As Samuel read on, the scope of Silas's mission became clear. For over 60 years, his great-uncle had been quietly acquiring pieces of African-American culture and history that were being discarded, ignored, or deliberately destroyed. He'd haunted estate sales, contacted families of deceased artists, and built a network of collectors and historians who shared his vision. The journal revealed a man obsessed with preservation, willing to live in poverty to fund his acquisitions. Every purchase was carefully documented, along with its significance and the circumstances that had made it available. A widow selling her husband's art collection to pay medical bills. A library disposing of irrelevant manuscripts. Families who didn't understand the value of what they'd inherited. The phoenix, Silas had written in a later entry, rises from ashes. Our culture has been burned again and again, but it cannot be destroyed as long as someone remembers, as long as someone keeps the flame alive. Samuel read until his phone battery died and he had to retrieve a flashlight from his car. The journal was mesmerizing, heartbreaking, and inspiring all at once. His great-uncle emerged not as the eccentric recluse Samuel had imagined, but as a passionate scholar and guardian who dedicated his life to a cause larger than himself. Entry after entry detailed the painstaking work of preservation, controlling humidity, protecting from light damage, documenting provenance. Silas had turned part of his house into a conservation laboratory, creating climate-controlled storage that rivaled professional institutions. The hidden room was just one of several spaces he'd created to protect his collection. The final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand, revealed Silas's growing concern about what would happen to the collection after his death. He'd never married, had no children, and his few remaining relatives had shown no interest in his dusty old books. The last entry, dated just weeks before his death, was a single line that pierced Samuel's heart. I pray that whoever finds this will understand what it means. The phoenix must not be allowed to die. Samuel sat in the darkness, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of cultural treasures, feeling the weight of his great-uncle's life work pressing down on him. According to the inventory sheets he'd found, the complete collection was valued at over $300 million. Enough money to solve every problem in his life, to give his mother the best medical care, to secure his own future beyond his wildest dreams. But as he read Silas's words, as he held manuscripts that contained the voices of generations, Samuel understood that this wasn't just about money. This was about responsibility, about carrying forward a mission that had consumed one man's entire life. The beam of his flashlight played across the careful stacks of crates, each one a small piece of a larger story, the story of a people's struggles and triumphs, their art and literature, their contributions to the American experience. Stories that had been deemed unworthy of preservation by mainstream institutions, but that Silas had recognized as priceless. Samuel's phone, plugged into a portable charger, buzzed with a text message. His mother. How's the house, honey? Are you going to be able to save it? He stared at the message for a long time before responding. Still working on it, Mama, but I think I found something important. As he prepared to leave the hidden room, Samuel noticed something else. A small brass plaque mounted near the doorway that he'd missed in his initial excitement. Engraved on its surface was the image of a phoenix rising from flames, its wings spread wide, surrounded by the words, Custos Memoriae, Latin for guardian of memory. Below the image, in Silas's careful script, was a final message. For whoever comes after, the flame is now yours to tend. Samuel turned off his flashlight and made his way back through the house in darkness, his mind spinning with possibilities and fears. He'd come here to tear down a building and had instead discovered a legacy that could change not just his life, but the understanding of American history itself. But with that discovery came questions that gnawed at him as he drove home through the Georgia dusk. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? How could he even begin to prove the authenticity of items that weren't supposed to exist? And if word got out about what he'd found, how could he protect it from those who might not share Silas's reverence for preservation? The weight of $300 million in hidden treasure should have felt like liberation, Instead, it felt like a burden almost too heavy to bear. Samuel couldn't sleep. For 3 nights after his discovery, he'd lain awake staring at the ceiling, Silas's journal entries playing on repeat in his mind. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Aaron Douglas's signature, felt the weight of Langston Hughes's unpublished manuscript, heard the whispers of history calling to him from that hidden room. On the 4th morning, he called in sick to school and returned to Maple Street with a thermos of coffee and every piece of archival equipment he could borrow from Jefferson High's understocked library. He needed to understand not just what Silas had collected, but how he'd managed to assemble such an extraordinary archive while living the life of a working-class man in rural Georgia. The house felt different now that he knew its secrets. Every creaking floorboard seemed to whisper stories. Every shadow held the possibility of another hidden chamber. Samuel moved through the rooms methodically, using techniques he'd learned in graduate school to search for other concealed spaces. He found 2 more. Behind a false wall in Silas's bedroom, Samuel discovered what could only be described as a research library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the space, filled with reference books, exhibition catalogs, and auction records dating back decades. A desk in the center held a manual typewriter and stacks of correspondence with museums, universities, and private collectors around the world. The letters revealed the depth of Silas's scholarship. He'd maintained relationships with curators at the Schomburg Center, professors at Howard University, and collectors in New York and Chicago. They'd written to him seeking his expertise on authentication, asking for photographs of pieces in his collection, consulting him on historical questions. Samuel's quiet, unassuming great-uncle had been a respected authority in circles Samuel had only dreamed of joining. One letter, from a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, was particularly revealing. "Mr. Jones, your research on the lost works of the Harlem Renaissance continues to astound us. The photographic documentation you've provided of the Douglas paintings fills crucial gaps in our understanding of his developmental period. We remain hopeful that someday you'll consider allowing public access to your collection." Silas's typed response, carbon-copied and filed, was polite but firm. "I appreciate your interest, but I cannot risk exposing these works to institutional politics or public scrutiny until I'm certain they'll be properly protected and contextualized. Too many of our treasures have been mishandled or minimized by well-meaning institutions." Samuel found photographs that documented the collection's growth over the decades. Pictures of Silas as a young man, carefully wrapping paintings and manuscripts, his face serious with concentration. Images of him meeting with elderly African Americans, some in modest homes, others in what looked like museums or galleries, always with the same careful, respectful demeanor. One photograph stopped Samuel cold. It showed Silas with a woman Samuel recognized from his textbooks, Dr. Dorothy Porter Wesley, the legendary librarian who'd built Howard University's collection into one of the world's premier archives of Black history. They stood before a display case, Silas holding what looked like the Langston Hughes manuscript Samuel had found. A note on the back, in Dr. Porter Wesley's handwriting, read, "For Silas, a true guardian of our heritage. May your work preserve what institutions fear to protect." DPW, 1975. The second hidden space, accessed through a panel behind the kitchen stove, contained something even more precious than artifacts. It held the human stories behind them. File after file of interviews Silas had conducted with the families of artists, writers, and musicians. Oral histories recorded on aging cassette tapes, their labels written in his careful script. Samuel spent hours listening to voices from the past. An elderly woman describing how her uncle, a jazz musician, had been cheated out of his compositions by white record producers. A man recounting how his father's paintings had been dismissed by galleries as primitive and sold for pennies to pay rent. A daughter explaining how her mother's poetry had been rejected by publishers who said there was no market for Black women's voices. Each story was heartbreaking, but what struck Samuel most was the pattern they revealed. These weren't isolated incidents of prejudice. They were systematic erasure, a deliberate effort to minimize or eliminate African American contributions to American culture. Silas had documented not just the art and literature that had survived, but the forces that had tried to destroy it. In one particularly moving interview, an elderly man named Thomas Carey described selling his father's collection to Silas in 1967. "My daddy painted all his life, but couldn't get nobody to take him serious. When he died, I was going to burn them paintings. Figured they was just taking up space, but Mr. Silas, he looked at them pictures like they was made of gold. He told me they was important, that they told a story people needed to hear. He paid me fair money, more than anybody else would have, but that wasn't why I sold to him. I sold to him because I could see he understood what they meant. The tapes revealed the care Silas had taken not just to acquire pieces, but to preserve their stories. He'd documented the circumstances of each acquisition, the family histories, the social conditions that had led to the art being undervalued or threatened. He wasn't just collecting objects, he was preserving entire narratives that might otherwise have been lost. Samuel found detailed correspondence with authenticators and historians, documenting the provenance of each major piece. The Aaron Douglas painting had come from the estate of a Harlem family who'd been forced to sell during the Depression. The Langston Hughes manuscript had been rescued from a library that was disposing of duplicate materials. The Baldwin King correspondence had been acquired from Baldwin's estate, items that hadn't been included in the official donation to Yale because they were deemed too personal, but it was in Silas's personal journal that Samuel found the most revealing entries. His great-uncle had struggled with the same questions that now tormented Samuel. What right did he have to these treasures? How could he balance preservation with access? What would happen to the collection if he couldn't find a worthy successor? I sometimes wonder if I'm a guardian or a thief, Silas had written in 1982. These pieces should be in museums, should be seen by scholars and students. But I've watched too many institutions treat our heritage as curiosities, footnotes to the real story of American culture. I've seen important works disappear into storage, never to be displayed. I've seen our stories sanitized and simplified until they lose all their power. Better that they remain hidden than that they be diminished. Later entries revealed Silas's growing isolation and the weight of his responsibility. I carry the voices of generations in these rooms. Every painting, every manuscript, every photograph represents someone's dream deferred, someone's story silenced. I cannot let them be silenced again, but I cannot carry this burden forever. Who will tend the flame when I'm gone? Samuel found evidence that Silas had tried to establish relationships with several major museums and universities, but each negotiation had ended in frustration. Institutions wanted to acquire pieces individually, separating them from their context. They wanted to control how the stories were told, to fit them into existing narratives rather than let them speak for themselves. Silas had refused every offer. "They want our treasures," he'd written after one particularly disappointing meeting, "but not our truth. They want to display Aaron Douglas's paintings but not discuss why they were hidden. They want to quote Langston Hughes, but not examine why his words were rejected. They want the beauty of our culture without the pain of our history." In the final years of his life, Silas had become increasingly concerned about the collection's future. Several entries mentioned his hope that a family member might share his passion, but his attempts to connect with relatives had been unsuccessful. Samuel's own father had visited once in the 1990s, but had shown no interest in Silas's work, dismissing it as obsession with old junk. The last substantial entry in the journal, dated just months before Silas's death, revealed his final plan. "I have made arrangements for the collection to pass to Samuel. He is young, educated, and from what I've observed, possesses the kind of moral character this responsibility requires. I pray he will understand what I've tried to preserve here, and that he will have the wisdom to know what to do with it. The phoenix rises from ashes, but only if someone is willing to tend the fire." Samuel closed the journal, his hands shaking. Silas hadn't left him this inheritance by accident or default. He'd chosen him deliberately, after years of observation and consideration. The weight of that choice pressed down on him like a physical force. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Samuel of the phoenix on the brass plaque. He'd spent the entire day immersed in his great-uncle's world, following the paper trail of a life dedicated to preserving what others had tried to erase. But with understanding came new fears. The collection wasn't just valuable, it was revolutionary. The items Silas had preserved could rewrite chapters of American cultural history, could force a reconsideration of who and what had been deemed worthy of remembrance. That kind of power attracted attention, and not all of it would be welcome. Samuel's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Haven't heard from you today, everything okay?" He stared at the message, then at the boxes of irreplaceable treasures surrounding him. Everything was far from okay. He'd inherited not just a collection, but a crusade, and he had no idea if he was strong enough to carry it forward. The paranoia started small. a white sedan parked across from the house on Maple Street that Samuel didn't recognize. A man in an expensive suit asking questions at Thompson's Hardware about restoration projects in the neighborhood. Phone calls to his apartment that rang twice and then stopped. Each incident alone could be explained away, but together they formed a pattern that made Samuel's skin crawl. It had been 2 weeks since his discovery, and Samuel felt like he was living 2 lives. By day, he taught his classes at Jefferson High, going through the motions of discussing the Revolutionary War, while his mind raced with thoughts of hidden manuscripts and unpublished poetry. By night, he returned to Silas's house, diving deeper into the collection while constantly looking over his shoulder. The weight of the secret was crushing him. He'd lost 15 pounds. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his mother had started asking if he was using drugs. He wanted to tell someone, needed to tell someone, but every scenario he imagined ended in disaster. Tell the authorities, and they'd seize everything while they sorted out legal questions that could take years to resolve. Tell a colleague, and word would spread through academic circles like wildfire. Tell his mother, and the stress might kill her. So he carried the burden alone, and it was eating him alive. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Samuel was in the hidden research library, photographing pages from a Frederick Douglass journal he'd discovered, when he heard a car door slam outside. He froze, listening. Footsteps on the gravel driveway, the creak of the front porch steps. Samuel quickly shut off his flashlight and crept to the front window. A black SUV with tinted windows was parked where his car had been an hour earlier. 2 men stood on the porch, one tall and thin in a charcoal suit, the other shorter and broader with the build of someone accustomed to physical intimidation. The tall man knocked, a polite but insistent rhythm. "Mr. Jones, we know you're in there. We'd like to have a conversation." Samuel's mouth went dry. He'd been careful, or so he thought. He only visited the house at night, never stayed long, and always checked to make sure he wasn't followed. Apparently, it hadn't been careful enough. "Mr. Jones, my name is David Thorne. I represent certain parties who have an interest in items that may have belonged to your late uncle. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for any cultural artifacts you might have discovered." The voice was smooth, professional, but carried an undertone that raised the hair on Samuel's neck. This wasn't a casual inquiry. These men knew exactly what they were looking for. Samuel remained silent, barely breathing. After what felt like an eternity, he heard the footsteps retreat. Car doors slammed and the SUV pulled away. But Samuel stayed hidden for another hour, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he finally emerged from the house, he found a business card wedged in the front door. Elegant black lettering on expensive cardstock. David Thorne, Private Acquisitions, discretion guaranteed. No phone number, just an email address and a handwritten note on the back. Time is a factor. Others are less patient than we are. Samuel drove home through back roads, checking his mirrors constantly. The message was clear. He wasn't the only one who knew about Silas's collection. But how? And who else was looking for it? The answer came 2 days later, in a phone call that changed everything. "Samuel?" The voice was elderly, female, with a refined accent that spoke of education and culture. "My name is Dr. Evelyn Washington. I was a friend of your Uncle Silas. I believe we need to talk." Samuel's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what—" "The Phoenix Project," she interrupted gently. "I know about the collection, Samuel. I helped Silas acquire some of the pieces, and I know you're in danger." They met at a small cafe in Atlanta, an hour's drive from Millbrook. Dr. Washington was in her 70s, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been a professor of African American studies at Spelman College for 40 years before retiring, and she'd known Silas for almost as long. "Your uncle was one of the most important preservationists of our time," she said, stirring her coffee with deliberate precision. "But he made enemies along the way, people who wanted access to his collection, who saw dollar signs instead of cultural heritage." She explained that word of Silas's death had traveled quickly through certain circles: auction houses, private collectors, dealers who specialized in acquiring culturally significant items through questionable means. Several had been watching the house, waiting to see what would happen to the inheritance. "David Thorne is just the most sophisticated of them," Dr. Washington said. "He represents clients who prefer to remain anonymous, wealthy collectors who want to own pieces of history regardless of how they obtain them. But he's not the most dangerous." Samuel's coffee grew cold as she described a shadow network of people who trafficked in stolen cultural artifacts, items liberated from museums during conflicts, pieces sold by families who didn't understand their value, works acquired through legal loopholes and moral compromises. Silas's collection represented the kind of prize that could make careers and fortunes. Your uncle spent decades keeping these vultures at bay, Dr. Washington continued. He was smart, careful, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting what he'd preserved. But now that he's gone, they're circling, Samuel finished. Exactly, and they know you're not equipped to fight them off. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Samuel's life. Dr. Washington laid out the stark realities he faced. The collection couldn't remain hidden forever. Too many people knew of its existence. If Samuel tried to sell pieces individually, he'd be drawn into a world of legal challenges and authentication battles that could take years and cost more than the items were worth. But if he tried to donate everything to an institution, he'd lose control over how the story was told and what happened to Silas's carefully preserved context. There's another option, she said finally. One that Silas and I discussed in his final years, but that he wasn't ready to pursue. She pulled a manila folder from her briefcase and slid it across the table. Inside were architectural plans, legal documents, and what looked like a business proposal. A museum, she said. Not just any museum, but one designed specifically to tell the story Silas spent his life preserving. The story of how African American culture survived systematic attempts at erasure, how individuals like your uncle became guardians of heritage that institutions failed to protect. Samuel stared at the plans. They showed a modern building designed around the principle of preservation and education, gallery spaces that could display the collection in proper context, research facilities for scholars, and educational programs that could bring the stories to new generations. The funding? Samuel asked. Would come from the collection itself. We've identified pieces that could be sold. Items where Silas has complete provenance and that aren't unique. The proceeds would fund construction and establish an endowment. The irreplaceable pieces would become the museum's core collection, permanently protected from commercial exploitation. It was elegant, idealistic, and terrifying. Samuel would be trading the possibility of personal wealth for the chance to continue Silas's mission on a scale his uncle had only dreamed of, but it would also make him a target for everyone who wanted to profit from the collection's dispersal. I need time to think, Samuel said. Dr. Washington nodded, but her expression was grave. Time is exactly what you don't have. David Thorne's visit was a courtesy call. The next approach won't be so polite. That night, Samuel sat in his apartment with the business plan spread across his kitchen table. His mother was asleep in the next room, her oxygen concentrator humming softly. The sound that had once comforted him now felt like a countdown timer, a reminder of how much he had to lose. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The offer stands, but not indefinitely. Make the smart choice. Samuel deleted the message, but the threat lingered. He was being watched, pressured, forced into a corner. The treasure that should have been his salvation was becoming his prison. He picked up the photograph Dr. Washington had given him. Silas standing with Frederick Douglass's great-grandson, both men smiling as they held a manuscript that had been in the family for generations. The pride in their faces was unmistakable, the sense of continuity profound. "What would you do, Uncle Silas?" Samuel whispered to the empty room, but he knew the answer. Silas had already told him in journal entries written over decades of struggle and sacrifice. The phoenix must not be allowed to die. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, the flame had to be passed to the next generation. Samuel closed the business plan and made his decision, but as he prepared for bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to step into a battle he might not be strong enough to win. Outside his window, a car drove slowly past his building. It might have been coincidence, but Samuel no longer believed in coincidence. The real fight was just beginning. Samuel stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside Silas's house, feeling the weight of the brass phoenix medallion he now wore around his neck, the same one he'd found in his uncle's personal effects. Today would determine whether the Phoenix Project lived or died. 3 months had passed since his meeting with Dr. Washington. 3 months of legal battles, authentication processes, and constant pressure from David Thorne and his associates. Samuel had lost 25 pounds, his job at Jefferson High, and nearly his sanity, but he'd also gained something invaluable: a team. Dr. Washington had connected him with others who shared Silas's vision, lawyers who specialized in cultural preservation, museum curators tired of institutional compromises, and descendants of the artists whose work Silas had saved. Together, they'd formed the Phoenix Heritage Foundation, with Samuel as its reluctant but determined president. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the morning silence. A convoy of trucks arrived, not the threatening black SUVs Samuel had grown accustomed to, but white vans bearing the logos of professional art handlers and conservation specialists. Today, after months of planning, they were moving the collection to its new home. "You ready for this, Dr. A?" Washington emerged from the lead vehicle, her silver hair gleaming in the sunrise. Samuel nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. "Silas spent 60 years building this. We've got one chance to honor that legacy." The next few hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Each piece was photographed in its original location, then carefully wrapped and transported by specialists who understood they weren't just moving objects. They were relocating pieces of American history. The Aaron Douglas painting, the Langston Hughes manuscripts, the Baldwin King correspondence. All of it emerged from decades of hiding into the light of day. Samuel watched the convoy depart, then took one last walk through the empty house. The hidden rooms that had once held treasures now held only memories and the faint smell of preservation materials, but the house itself had been transformed. Instead of demolition, it would become the Foundation's research center, a place where scholars could study the intersection of art, culture, and preservation. The museum building had risen on a plot of land just outside Atlanta, funded by the careful sale of duplicate items and the generous donations of supporters who believed in the mission. Samuel had insisted on one non-negotiable feature, a wall bearing Silas's words about the phoenix rising from ashes, surrounded by photographs of every person who had trusted his uncle with their family's treasures. Opening day arrived with unexpected fanfare. What Samuel had imagined as a quiet ceremony became a celebration that drew visitors from across the country. The mayor of Atlanta spoke. Civil rights leaders offered blessings. But the moment that broke Samuel's composure came when an elderly woman approached him in the gallery. "That painting there," she said, pointing to a portrait of a jazz musician, "that's my grandfather. I thought everything he did was lost when our house burned in 1962. Samuel watched her study the piece, tears streaming down her face. "Your uncle saved him," she whispered. "He saved my grandfather's legacy." Throughout the day, similar scenes played out. Families discovering relatives they'd thought forgotten. Students seeing their heritage reflected in ways their textbooks had never shown them. Scholars gasping at items they'd only read about in footnotes. But the most meaningful moment came that evening as Samuel stood alone in the gallery after the crowds had gone. His mother, despite her fragile health, had insisted on attending the opening. She'd spent an hour in a wheelchair, studying every display, reading every placard. "Silas would be proud," she said, taking Samuel's hand. "But I think he'd be even prouder of who you've become." Samuel looked around the galleries, at the careful displays that told not just the story of African American culture, but the story of its preservation. Interactive exhibits explained how items had been lost to history and how people like Silas had worked to save them. Video testimonials from families like the jazz musician's granddaughter showed the human impact of cultural preservation. In the final gallery, visitors could see a recreation of Silas's hidden room, complete with the brass phoenix plaque. But now, instead of being sealed away, it invited people to understand the necessity of protecting heritage in all its forms. "The phoenix rises from ashes," Samuel read aloud from the inscription, "but only when someone tends the fire." Dr. Washington joined him, both of them looking at the steady stream of visitors still flowing through the galleries as evening fell. "You know David Thorne made one final offer yesterday," she said. $50 million for the entire collection. No questions asked. Samuel smiled. "I know. I sent him a visitor's pass. Figured he might learn something." The Phoenix Heritage Museum became more than Samuel had dared hope. Within its first year, it welcomed over 200,000 visitors, hosted international scholars, and established educational programs that reached students across the Southeast. But more importantly, it sparked a movement. Other communities began examining their own hidden histories, their own forgotten treasures. Samuel kept his promise to his mother, using part of the foundation's proceeds to ensure she received the best medical care available. But he discovered something unexpected. The work itself had become medicine for his soul. Every day brought new discoveries, new connections between past and present. 5 years later, Samuel stood in the same spot where he'd first swung a sledgehammer at a wall, believing he was demolishing an old house. The research center hummed with activity, graduate students studying original documents, community members attending lectures, children participating in art programs. His phone buzzed with a message from a curator in Chicago. Found a cache of Augusta Savage sculptures in an estate sale. Family wants to donate to Phoenix Foundation. Can you authenticate? Samuel smiled, tucking the phone away. The fire Silas had tended for 60 years now burned brighter than ever, tended by a community of guardians who understood that preserving the past was the only way to protect the future. The phoenix had indeed risen from ashes, and Samuel Jones, no longer a struggling teacher drowning in debt, but a guardian of memory and keeper of flames, had learned that some inheritances are worth more than money. They're worth everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next incredible discoveries. Click to watch the next video and share it with friends who believe that broken things still deserve to shine.